One of the things that we've been exploring in these Ghazali sessions has been kind of journey into the modern paradox, insofar as so much of the messages that modernity is beaming, particularly the young, is self-expression, self-discovery, self-affirmation, being yourself, discovering yourself, but at the same time conjoined with the paradox that modernity is very bad at defining what the human self might actually be. In the absence of a coherent doctrine of soul, or even a recognized medical understanding of consciousness, we are, as it were, urging a void, a vagueness, to come out of itself and to affirm itself. And many of the anxieties that young people in particular currently face nowadays, which are leading to increasing rates of addiction, rates of breakdown in relationships, anxiety, dieting disorders and so forth, bespeak a profound disquiet in the modern soul. On the one hand, modernity, and certainly the advertisers are telling us to go out and affirm ourselves, choose your own identity, choose your own gender, choose your own sexuality, choose your own body image. We are urged to make ourselves closer to what we think we truly are. But on the other hand, this absence of definition of human selfhood or human becoming is producing this tension, this hiatus, which is causing major anxiety and happiness issues amongst so many young people. So essentially the aim of our journey through the works of Ghazali is to see what happens when we take a very ancient and timeless classical human definition of what is selfhood, the opposition between ego and soul, the recognition that there are negative as well as positive tendencies and impulses within us, the recognition that human beings have always related to the sacred and have a need for a unifying principle in their lives, a direction, to see how these ancient teachings might actually offer us a way out of the current impasse of modernity and this crisis of identity and of selfhood that seems to be causing suffering amongst so many young people. I think part of the problem that we have is that our environment has become so secularized that people have forgotten what it is that they've forgotten. The normal human project for all time, that which is really part of the makeup of the human brain and defines the constants of human society, is a belief in the sacred and an understanding of the existence of a transcendent realm in which our behavior is rooted. And that central truth has been torn out of the modern soul so successfully and so long in the past now. In Europe it was the Enlightenment, if not before, that people have forgotten what it is that they no longer have. So they're walking around with this big hole in themselves, but nobody has told them that there ought to be something there. And they fill it with all kinds of pleasures, pastimes, desires, distractions, whether technologically enabled or otherwise, drugs sometimes. But nobody any longer remembers what it was that human life was about, that there was a foundation, that there was a direction, that there was a contemplative quiet space, that there was an experience of the holy, that there was a meaning to everything that we saw in nature. This fundamental master signifier of the human view of the cosmos has been confiscated, and we are ignorant of the fact that we are ignorant of that, and that places us in a very, very difficult situation. And getting people back to square one is the first task of religious teachers and guides in every culture now, and it's not easy. Well, Imam al-Ghazali was a master of all the Islamic sciences. He was mainly known in his time as an expert in Sharia, in Islamic law, and also as a master metaphysician. But he was also, I think, perhaps Islam's greatest psychologist, insofar as, because he himself had been through a terrible internal crisis, a loss of faith, a loss of confidence in his own motivation, that he was somebody who turned within and looked unblinkingly at the faults within himself and his motivations. So on the basis of his own inner traumas and his own inner journey, he was able to map out a theory of the soul and of consciousness, which is always the most difficult kind of theory. It's not easy to look at ourselves. That was not just a kind of replication of ancient Greek ideas, of Plato's idea of the mind having three aspects and different kinds of passions, which was familiar in his day, the scientific psychology of the ancient world, but also provides a kind of practical ethical means whereby we can actually look within ourselves into that mysterious cave full of strange monsters and half-understood shapes, that darkness within us, and see how we can understand what's going on, and also see how we can impose some kind of regularity and clean it up. And of course, he reminds us that this is, in a sense, the most important of all human tasks. Because everything that I do with the world outside myself, I do on the basis of my consciousness, the thinking I. If that thinking I is a mess and is thinking poorly and is in the grip of half-understood, egotistic, pleasurable impulses, the way it understands the outside world, the way it thinks about theories, the way it constructs arguments for the nature of reality, the way it deals ethically with the natural world and with human beings is going to be defective. And in our culture, we tend not to do much self-understanding and self-knowledge. Instead, we immediately rush to the laboratory to understand the X-ray galaxy that's just been discovered somewhere or other, but the actual human subject that's perceiving that has not been properly mastered or disciplined. So he's a subtle theorist, and particularly when he deals with the subject that we've been looking at in these lectures here in the Rosales, looking at the question of intention, recognizes the extreme difficulty of it, that we do not just have a moral sphere in which we act, and a conscious mind which is, unless we're asleep, always acting, it's our natural mode of being, but we have certain very severe handicaps in that so many of the things we do without intention. We're kind of automated much of the time. And the number of serious decisions we take in a day might actually be surprisingly small. When we think about it, it's quite depressing to think how automated most of our lives are. And part of the task of religion is to wake us up by giving us a sense of the enormous importance of every moment, its irreplaceability, and the need to be sure that we're doing things for the right reason. We know what's right because there's a revelation, there are scriptures, there is an absolute canon of right and wrong. So to sanctify every moment with the knowledge of the potential rightness of our decision is also to actually come alive in that moment and to reduce those grey times when we're just drifting through life following impulses or habits, which is a form of death, really. Some people's lives are very short, even though they seem to live to be 80 or 90, because the consciousness in their life is so sporadic. So this is part of the Quranic invitation that God is inviting us to what gives us life. And this idea of bringing life is part of the idea of Imam al-Ghazali's great book, the revival, the bringing to life of the sciences of religion. So the center of this, according to this particular section of his book, is intention. Religion is interested in what we do, morality matters, but also, and even more importantly, in why we do those things. So he has a long disquisition, for instance, on whether it's possible for a sin to become a virtue if you have a different intention behind it. And he also has a very long explanation of what might seem to be counterintuitive, which is that we cannot change our intentions. We might think, well, of course I can change the reason why I do things, but in fact, we are always driven by intentions that are just within us. If I eat, it's because I'm hungry, and that hunger is not something I have any control about. If I fall in love, I can't decide to fall in love or not to fall in love. I can't go to a woman and say, I've decided to fall in love with you, because she won't hear that. It's just our motivational dimension is something that is, as he says, غير داخل تحت الاختيار. It's not volitional. That doesn't mean, however, that we just give up and become fatalists. What we have to do is to look at the reasons for our motivations. So why am I hungry? Or why is it that I love this person? Or why is it that I want to do this action, not that action? Why do I want to go to Istanbul and not go to Cairo? What are the reasons for my motivations? And that's where we can do the serious spiritual work. So it's obscure. Underneath our actions, there is the intention, which is a hard thing to grasp. And sometimes we have various intentions when performing a single act. And beneath that, there are the underlying motivations and the emotions and the desires, and often quite dirty, squalid, sort of almost Freudian subconscious stuff that is pushing to create this intention. And that's where we can do the work, identifying why we have intentions rather than trying to change the intention directly. So this is his approach. So it's quite optimistic in that he thinks we can actually become people who have consistently good intentions, but it's a hard task, and it does require this meditation, this contemplative introspection to look at ourselves and be honest about the mess that is within. Yes, I think Ghazali's message is surprisingly contemporary. He was writing in a completely different universe 900 years ago, But the human issues and states that he's referring to are part of the unchangeable nature of man. We still have the same impulses, the same hopes, the same fears, the same gamut of emotions. Nobody's ever in history invented a new emotion, for instance. We really haven't changed. And in our time, which in some ways mirrors the time of confusion and instability in which he lived after the possibility of the overthrow of the traditional Sunni Islamic world, the age of the Crusades, real challenges to the integrity of his world and his intellectual civilization. There is a parallel in our world where everything seems to be coming unstuck, where old narratives of religion, of family, of city, of neighborhood, of language, of nation state are being challenged. Even fundamental things like sexuality and gender and everything is now being challenged. Everything is being liquidized, and nobody's quite sure what kind of new solid shape can emerge once this liquidization has taken place. And people feel uprooted, distracted, and because human beings do need coordinates, they need to know the meaning of things, they need to know what are the basic moral landmarks. It's not natural for us to be in a universe of floating particles. We belong in a society that is cohesive and interlocked. That the agenda that Imam Ghazali proposed to his people, actually very successfully, his book was really popular 9 centuries ago, I think, in my experience, does speak very strongly to people nowadays. Not just in the Islamic context, but more broadly. This idea that we are only happy when we have a purpose, and that the highest purpose that humanity has ever known across the gamut, the spectrum, the rainbow of world civilizations is the quest for the one, the good, the true, the meaning, the light behind everything, and that without that, we're just being liquidized again and again for the benefit of bankers, corporations, whoever it is that is steering the ship. That we can transcend all of that and find once again a time and a place within ourselves where we can actually be still and contemplate moving in a particular direction. So Imam Ghazali has this complex system, complex because life is complex, and complex also because our interior lives are even more complex. It's not a simple button that one presses in order to put everything right. Questions of identity, selfhood, direction, meaning are not easy. And he doesn't offer us any shortcuts. But his message that we need to turn within if the world without is ever to make sense and therefore to be healed is something that I find transcends religion and all other boundaries and makes sense to everybody, because after all we do ultimately share a common humanity. We all want to be happy, we all want to live in a cohesive and meaningful world. So his message is absolutely contemporary, even though he is the greatest thinker of an ancient religious civilization. Yes, I think Ghazali is very interesting in that his life mirrors his spiritual teachings in a very iconic way. He did have this crisis, apparently when lecturing from the pulpit in the middle of a philosophy lecture to some of the brightest minds of the day, and just wondered why he was doing it and had essentially an existential breakdown. He goes off and wanders in the desert and the forest for, we're told, about 10 years. Essentially, the real journey being within, seeing what the inward landscape is like, how he can recover himself from this terrible inner trauma that he'd suffered. And then, evidently having succeeded, with his certainties restored, he goes back, he resumes his family life, he even resumes his job teaching at one of the great universities of the day, but having, as it were, recentered his life and made sure that he has taken the broom of religion and swept out all of the impurities from the stable of his heart, so that he's just single-minded, as he says, sadiq, truthful in what he is doing, without multiple intentions, without being contaminated by the desire for academic preferment or glory or the other various rather base and childish motivations that often motivate academics. And that was obviously a very painful process for him, but insofar as he was able to do it, as you say, the story is an optimistic one. And history is full of people who, with God's grace, have been able to turn themselves around, often from quite sort of catastrophic backgrounds, simply through force of will, desire to change, a love of the beauty that one is called to, a disgust at the ugliness that overcomes people who give way to their own lower impulses. That realization, when it's clear in the human mind, is the strongest motivation in history. And it produces Imam al-Ghazali, it produces St. Augustine, it produces Malcolm X, it produces some of the great, most transformative characters in history. So that inward metanoia, that tawbah, that turning around, which is determined after divine grace by a real strength of will, is the essential skill that Imam al-Ghazali wishes us to acquire in this work. In other words, actually to grab the steering wheel of our vehicles and without the aid of any kind of power steering, actually try to avoid oncoming traffic and to travel to the safe destination. So he's talking about the weightiest and the most important of all human tasks, which is self-mastery and making sure that one is headed in the right direction in the journey of life.